Airport cop accused black woman of flying without a ticket, but she's the one funding the airline. They say you never truly know the power someone holds until you cross them. This is the story of one fateful day at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a day when a loud, narrow-minded TSA agent thought he could play judge and jury based solely on the color of someone's skin. Little did he know that the black woman he was harassing wasn't just another passenger. She was the unseen force behind one of the world's biggest airlines, pulling the strings without public fanfare. What followed was a whirlwind of drama, retribution, and unexpected alliances that would change both their lives forever. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with life on this particular morning. Business travelers lugged rolling carry-ons while glancing anxiously at their watches, families corralled excited children, and a mosaic of diverse faces converged under the fluorescent lights that had probably seen it all. The airport's labyrinthine corridors stretched like arteries through a humming body of travelers. Overhead, the constant echo of flight announcements painted the routine demands of modern travel. People lined up at coffee shops for an overpriced latte, some rummaging through wallets for that last bit of cash, others fumbling with phone apps to confirm electronic payment. Every minute or so, you'd hear the delighted squeal of a child seeing a plane taxi by, or the hushed sob of someone bidding a loved one farewell. Among the bustle stood a woman named Octavia Reynolds, clad in a sleek black jumpsuit, a pair of discreet but elegant pearl earrings, and an understated watch. Octavia's calm poise contrasted with the surrounding airport madness. She was tall, her skin a deep bronze that caught the overhead lights. Her hair was styled in neat shoulder-length coils, framed by stylish reading glasses perched on her nose. She carried herself with an unspoken assurance. Anyone who happened to glance her way might think she was a professional of some sort. A lawyer, a professor, maybe an executive. No one suspected she was, in fact, one of the largest investors in a major airline, Delta Airlines. Octavia preferred keeping a low profile. She had no social media presence, seldom appeared in photographs, and most people within Delta's corporate structure knew her only by name. Public attention was not her style. She was far more comfortable influencing from behind the scenes, letting her money speak volumes in boardrooms and philanthropic endeavors. Although she lived in Atlanta, she rarely flew from Hartsfield-Jackson for personal trips. This day was unusual in many ways. Octavia had a flight to Los Angeles intending to finalize a charitable partnership that would sponsor minority-owned businesses in the city. She hoped to merge that philanthropic work with new airline initiatives, something that could impact thousands of people, all done quietly under her watchful eye. She held in her discreet carry-on bag some important documents that only a select few individuals had ever glimpsed. Official statements linking her name to significant shares of Delta Airlines. Even as she carefully prepared for her trip, checking and rechecking that everything was in order, she had no clue her morning was about to be flipped upside down. A few yards away, at one of the busier security checkpoints, TSA officer Bradley Foster stood with arms folded. Bradley was a big man with a barrel chest, shaved head, and a piercing gaze that often unsettled travelers. He wore the standard TSA uniform, complete with the embroidered patch on his shoulder, and a hardened expression that seemed to broadcast his authority at all times. Bradley prided himself on being an expert at reading people. Unfortunately, his idea of reading people often boiled down to a lifetime's worth of prejudices, misguided assumptions, and a sense of self-righteousness that he believed came with the uniform. Two of his colleagues, fellow TSA officers Jasmine Perez and Michael Thompson, were used to Bradley's tough guy routine. They'd rolled their eyes behind his back on more than one occasion, but rarely confronted him. Their group oversaw the security lines in this terminal, and Bradley liked to think of himself as the star of that show. Day in and day out, he would pick out individuals who looked suspicious to him, a term that, in his mind, often included an irrational selection of Middle Eastern men, women in hijabs, Latino travelers, and black passengers. Some he would interrogate about their final destinations, Others he'd rummage through their carry-ons with questionable thoroughness. Occasionally, his behavior would raise eyebrows from travelers or colleagues who couldn't quite stomach his borderline harassment. But so far, no one had reported him. Or if they did, none of those reports had gained serious traction. When it came to Bradley's superiors, he knew how to toe the line just enough to appear as though he was simply doing his job. He had a stack of standard catchphrases, just a routine check, random selection, TSA protocol, that typically halted complaints in their tracks. This morning was shaping up to be an ordinary day for him, pulling aside a man in a dashiki for further scrutiny, sternly questioning a Latinx teenager about the contents of their backpack. As Bradley scanned the serpentine queue of travelers inching forward toward the conveyor belts and metal detectors, his eyes locked onto Octavia. He didn't know who she was, of course. All he saw was a tall black woman in an outfit that, to his twisted logic, looked too fancy. A traveler who carried herself with a self-assuredness that unsettled him. She had only a small carry-on bag and no rummage of crumpled boarding passes in her hand. In his eyes, that alone was suspicious. He watched as she breezed up to the security officer checking IDs. He had no idea she'd already shown her boarding pass electronically, or that she was guided to the designated line for TSA pre-check. For a moment, it appeared everything would go by the book as Octavia quietly proceeded to the body scanner. But Bradley, with his eagle eye on the queue, called out, "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass again." Octavia turned, slightly confused, because she had just shown it to another officer seconds ago. However, she complied. She took out her phone, which displayed her digital boarding pass, and offered it to Bradley. He studied it, wrinkling his brow in the performance of thoroughness. She was to be on Delta Flight 482 to LAX, which was set to board in roughly 2 hours. He didn't see anything amiss, but something about her calm confidence pricked at his ego. Looking up from the phone, Bradley narrowed his eyes. "Is this your phone, or does it belong to someone else?" he asked. Octavia blinked, perplexed. "It's mine," she replied, her tone neutral. She realized that perhaps he was just double-checking. "Is there a problem, officer?" Bradley let out a huff, handing the phone back roughly. "We'll see about that. Please step aside for a moment. I need to confirm a few details about your flight." With that, Bradley waved her towards a side area meant for further screening. Octavia's heart thudded with annoyance. She had done nothing wrong, carried no contraband, and had a legitimate pre-check pass. Still, she didn't want a confrontation, so she wordlessly followed his direction. Standing a few feet away, Officer Jasmine Perez glanced at Bradley questioningly. She knew that there was nothing suspicious in the quick check she'd done on Octavia. The flight information matched the official airline manifest. The phone's identification and picture matched Octavia's face. Plus, the scannable code was legitimate. Yet, Jasmine noticed the flicker of prejudice in Bradley's eyes. She'd seen it many times before. She sighed internally but said nothing, out of fear that confronting Bradley would spark conflict and put her position at risk. Meanwhile, Octavia tried not to let her frustration show. She was determined to keep her dignity, refusing to let this escalate more than it needed to. Still, she couldn't help feeling that sense of being singled out, the subtle tension that you become aware of when you've experienced discrimination often enough. But that was only the beginning. Little did she know, everything was about to get far more intense and far more outrageous before the morning was through. In the next few moments, events would unfold that would question the entire system in place at one of the busiest airports in the world. And ironically enough, it would bring to light the incredible role Octavia herself had been playing behind the scenes, not just at Delta, but in several philanthropic projects aimed at leveling the playing field for marginalized people. The day that started like any other would soon become a crucible of drama, revelation, and karmic justice. Octavia stood to the side, a forced calm in her posture, as Bradley pulled out a small device from his pocket, a handheld scanner connected to the TSA's internal verification system. He fiddled with it for what felt like a small eternity, glancing from the screen to Octavia. as though trying to find the missing piece of a puzzle that only existed in his mind. The security line continued to move, albeit slowly, with the disorganized murmur of travelers weaving around them. A mother tried to shush her crying toddler. A group of teenagers in matching jerseys joked about their upcoming sports tournament, and somewhere near the entrance, an elderly couple asked for directions in thick Southern accents. Bradley cleared his throat. "The system's not finding your boarding pass under your name," he declared loudly, garnering the attention of bystanders. The statement set off alarm bells for Octavia. She knew that was impossible. Moments earlier, the same system had verified her pass without issue. Her flight booking was intact. She had used Delta's official app to display her pass. Something was off. She struggled to keep her voice steady. "Officer, it was verified 2 minutes ago by your colleague." She gestured towards Jasmine Perez, who was staring at the unfolding spectacle with concern. "I don't understand why it wouldn't appear now." Bradley held her gaze, a smugness creeping into his expression as though he sensed a chance to escalate. "Well, Miss Reynolds, the system says it can't find your flight reservation under that name, or that confirmation number. Are you sure you have the right flight details?" His voice dripped with condescension, the unspoken implication, maybe this passenger had no right to be there at all. Nearby passengers began stealing glances, some with curiosity, others with the typical hurry of people who just want to get through security. A few were unsettled, seeing a security officer raise his voice at a black woman who seemed calm and cooperative. The tension radiated outward like a ripple in a pond. Octavia took a breath. "Yes, I'm sure. I booked with Delta Airlines. If something has changed in the system, it's likely a technical error." She shot Bradley a direct, unwavering look. "I'd appreciate if you could quickly verify this. My flight is in 2 hours. Bradley narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest in a stance meant to emphasize his authority. "We'll have to do a manual check. For now, please step into the private screening room. I'll have to search your belongings and verify your identity. Standard procedure, you understand." The last phrase was laced with sarcasm. He jerked his head toward a small, windowless room adjacent to the main security area. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, making the cramped space feel all the more claustrophobic. Octavia glanced at the small room and considered her options. The rational part of her wanted to simply walk away and speak to a higher-up, or call her personal contact at Delta, an executive who would smooth this over in seconds. But a different part of her, the side tired of having to run from every instance of bias, told her to let the officer follow his misguided routine. She would cooperate, perhaps gather evidence of how unfairly travelers of color could be treated, and then handle the situation through official channels. She was, after all, no ordinary passenger. There was a reason she had invested so much in airline equity. She'd encountered discrimination at airports one too many times, and now possessed the resources to make systemic changes. And so she nodded. "Fine, let's get this resolved," she replied, her voice calm but firm. The walk to the private screening room felt interminable, with passengers craning their necks to watch them pass. Once inside, Octavia placed her carry-on bag on a table. Bradley, with a gloved hand, unzipped it, rummaging through neatly folded clothes, a laptop, a small toiletry bag, and finally, a thin manila folder. He pulled out the folder, flipping through pages of what looked like official documents. They were, in fact, the exact records of her investments and philanthropic initiatives, much of it connected to Delta. "Got some official-looking documents here," Bradley said, raising an eyebrow. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking at. The letterhead read, "Delta Airlines Board of Directors, Corporate Affairs," with pages referencing large sums of capital. Octavia's name was embossed in certain sections, noting her position as a principal private investor. Bradley's confusion was evident. He'd never seen documentation like this, nor had any reason to. Still, he wasn't about to back down. "Might want to explain what these are, Miss Reynolds." Inwardly, Octavia groaned. She hadn't intended to flash that level of information to a random TSA officer. It was private, and she liked to keep it that way. But she also saw an opening. The moment for subterfuge had passed. Perhaps the easiest route was to be straightforward. They are documents showing my shareholdings and partnership with Delta Airlines, among other entities. I'm a major investor, so these are private statements for my reference. I was on my way to Los Angeles for a business meeting. She spoke measuredly, carefully. Bradley shot her a skeptical glare. A major investor, huh? So you're telling me you have a stake in Delta? The sarcasm in his tone remained thick, as though this was the most ridiculous claim he'd ever heard. Well, I hate to break it to you, but I see a lot of forged documents in this line of work. People try all sorts of stunts. Octavia remained composed, though frustration simmered in her chest. They're not forged, and if you would like to call the airline or have a supervisor contact them to verify, you'll get your proof. Bradley chuckled darkly. Oh, I'll be making some calls all right, because right now, Miss Reynolds, the system says you're not booked on any flight, let alone a Delta flight. So unless you can prove otherwise, we might have a case of attempted fraud. His statement escalated the confrontation to an official level, implying potential legal consequences. Jasmine Perez appeared at the doorway, her features tense. She'd overheard the exchange and felt compelled to step in. "Brad, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked, her voice low. With obvious annoyance, Bradley stepped out of the room, leaving Octavia alone with her open bag and the documents strewn about. In the short corridor outside, Jasmine lowered her tone. "Listen, I've checked her information. Everything matched up earlier. It's not like she just showed up with no reservation. I think there's some kind of glitch in the system, or maybe you miskeyed something. Just let me double-check her boarding pass data, okay?" Bradley clenched his jaw. "Jazz, I know what I saw. The system didn't recognize her. She's acting all high and mighty, claiming she's a big-shot investor. Doesn't that sound suspicious to you?" Jasmine sighed. "I'm not ignoring red flags, but we can't hold her like this just because you personally suspect something. At least let me run a second check. It's standard procedure anyway." Bradley grimaced. "Fine, but she doesn't leave this room until I confirm everything. We have protocol for these situations." With that, he stomped back in, while Jasmine headed off to find a spare terminal to run a more thorough background check. Left alone in the cramped screening room again, Octavia tried to keep her composure, though her pulse began to race. This was quickly escalating into a full-blown fiasco. She'd seen lesser incidents turn ugly for people of color at the hands of authority figures with biased instincts. She had always envisioned using her position to tackle these issues in a structured, methodical way. Now, ironically, she was at the epicenter of the exact scenario she'd sought to dismantle. Bradley resumed his rummaging, more out of a desire to reassert control than any real suspicion. He muttered questions about everyday items, scribbling notes on a form. "Where'd you get this laptop?" he asked at one point. "When did you last travel outside the country?" He peppered her with queries about her travel history, sometimes repeating the same question. If he thought he could intimidate her, he was mistaken. Octavia answered each question patiently, without flinching. After several long minutes, Jasmine returned. She gave Bradley a measured look. "I reached someone at Delta's gate staff," she said. "They're telling me there is indeed a glitch in the system. A portion of the passenger manifest for Flight 482 wasn't syncing correctly with the TSA system. They confirmed Miss Reynolds is definitely booked on that flight in first class. They also noted she's a frequent traveler with them, though they didn't specify her status." Bradley tried to hide his surprise. "Well, if that's the case, then someone from Delta's at fault. She still doesn't have the physical boarding pass, and you know that's unusual. And we need more verification about these suspicious documents, right? Let's not forget that." Jasmine exhaled slowly, taking in the tension. "From what Delta told me, Miss Reynolds is a respected passenger, and they'd prefer we help her get to the gate. We can do a final screening and let her through. Let's wrap this up, Brad." But Bradley doubled down. "Not so fast. These documents are claiming ownership stakes in Delta. That's serious business. For all we know, she's some scammer forging fancy paperwork to hustle unsuspecting passengers or employees. I'm going to need more time to verify every detail. We can't just let her waltz onto a plane without ensuring national security, you know. National security. The words he used to justify this fiasco. It made Octavia want to laugh out loud, but she held back. She recognized the scenario, a heavy-handed officer brandishing the term national security to justify overreach. She'd heard of such things happening to others, but never expected it to escalate to this point for her, especially given she was actually one of the airline's principal investors. "I don't mind you verifying the documents, officer," Octavia spoke up, her tone measured yet firm. "But I have a flight to catch, and a business meeting that affects hundreds of people waiting in Los Angeles. If you're going to detain me without cause, I'll need to place a call to my lawyer." Bradley's cheeks reddened. "Don't threaten me with lawyers, I'm doing my job." At that moment, Michael Thompson, another TSA officer, knocked on the open door. He looked concerned. "Brad, we've got a supervisor from the airline at the main checkpoint. He's asking about Miss Reynolds. Do you want me to bring him here?" Bradley grumbled under his breath. "Fine, bring him in." In less than 2 minutes, a tall man in a crisp Delta suit walked in. His name tag read, Martin Palmer, Delta Airlines Supervisor. He wore a polite but worried expression, as though he'd rushed from the Delta check-in counters. "Miss Reynolds, I'm so sorry for the confusion," he began, addressing Octavia. "We had an internal system error that failed to display some of our passenger data to TSA. Once we caught it, I came straight over." Bradley's gaze snapped between Martin and Octavia. He was clearly annoyed that an airline supervisor had come to set the record straight. Martin turned to Bradley with a polite but firm nod. "Officer, I have the correct documentation to verify Miss Reynolds' booking. Additionally, I can attest that she is—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She is a very important person to our airline. We have no concerns about her credentials." Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "I'm still not convinced about these documents." He gestured to the papers he had pulled from Octavia's bag. Martin took a quick glance at them, then cleared his throat. "These documents are private, but I can affirm they are consistent with her role." A moment of tension followed, Bradley's face twitching with the realization that he might be out of his league. Jasmine, sensing an opening, placed a calming hand on Bradley's shoulder. "Let's let Miss Reynolds pass, Brad. The airline has confirmed it's their glitch, not her ticket. We can finalize the paperwork later if needed." Bradley swallowed, still fuming. "Fine. But if it turns out any of this is fraudulent, I'll personally see to it she faces charges." Octavia wanted to roll her eyes, but forced herself to remain composed. She nodded, picking up her documents and tucking them neatly back into the manila folder. Martin offered to escort her personally to her gate, but not before Bradley managed one last remark. "Next time, bring a physical boarding pass," he sneered. "Makes life easier for everyone." Octavia said nothing, letting Martin lead her out. Her heart was still racing. She knew the confrontation was almost over, but she also sensed this was far from the end of the story. Certain incidents have a way of echoing far beyond their immediate resolution, and the humiliating experience she'd just endured would undoubtedly spark more than a private conversation or a mild complaint. If Bradley believed that was the last time he'd see her or hear of her, he was gravely mistaken. By the end of the day, he would come to realize exactly how powerful the woman he tried to humiliate truly was, and that realization would be the turning point in a drama that was only just beginning. Martin Palmer guided Octavia swiftly through the airport's corridors, ensuring she could bypass the throng of travelers who moved at a slower pace. As they made their way to the concourse, Martin apologized repeatedly for the confusion and embarrassment. He was a tall, lean man in his early 40s, known within Delta circles for being poised under pressure. Today, however, was testing even his composure. "Miss Reynolds, please know we flagged the system issue. That TSA officer had no right to treat you like that," Martin said, his voice earnest. "I can't tell you how sorry I am." "I appreciate that, Martin," Octavia replied quietly. "But this is hardly the first time I've seen this kind of attitude. Usually it's less extreme, but the prejudice is there, simmering. Martin nodded. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please let me know. They arrived at one of the airline lounges. Martin swiped a card that granted them entry to a quieter space with plush seating, ambient lighting, and a generous buffet along one wall. The hustle of the airport faded. He guided Octavia to a private meeting room inside the lounge, offering a seat at a sleek wooden table. A large window overlooked the runway, where she could see planes taxiing and taking off in the distance. "Can I get you anything to drink?" Martin asked, ever the professional host. Octavia shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you. I just want to sit for a moment." She set down her carry-on, still reeling from the confrontation. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, the incident had left a knot of frustration in her chest. She reminded herself that anger wouldn't serve her. Action would. Martin cleared his throat. "I understand if you want to file an official complaint against the TSA. Our station manager can help with that. In fact, I strongly encourage it. We can't stand by and let our valued customers, or especially in your case integral stakeholders, be treated this way." Octavia took a moment, folding her hands. "I'd like to escalate this through the proper channels, yes, but this goes beyond a single complaint. I've dealt with microaggressions my whole life. My position doesn't shield me completely from racism, clearly. I'd rather we tackle the root of this issue systematically. That's partially why I invested in Delta, to champion real, tangible change in how we train staff, and in the policies we support at airports across the country." She paused, exhaling. "Let's proceed carefully. I intend to speak to TSA management, the Department of Homeland Security, and my network of civil rights lawyers to see what can be done to reform these biases within airport security." Martin looked at her with admiration. "We'll back you 100%. Silence settled in, punctuated by the muffled announcements from beyond the lounge door. Octavia's gaze drifted back to the runway, her mind racing through the potential ripple effects of this incident. She had always envisioned her silent influence as a way to quietly shift corporate cultures, but sometimes, she realized, you need a more direct approach, and the universe had just handed her an incident too blatant to ignore. After a few minutes of decompressing, Octavia rose from her seat. "Thank you, Martin. If you don't mind, I'd like to make a quick call before boarding." "Of course," Martin replied. "Take as long as you need. Your flight boards in about 90 minutes, but we'll make sure you're accommodated." With that, he stepped out, leaving Octavia alone in the private lounge area. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts, and dialed a familiar number. A voice answered almost immediately. "Hey, cousin?" The voice was warm, female, with an unmistakable ring of affection. "Hey, Tasha," Octavia greeted. Tasha Chandler was not only her cousin but also an attorney specializing in civil rights and discrimination cases. She was fiercely dedicated to social justice, having pursued a law degree partly inspired by Octavia's philanthropic work. "Everything okay?" Tasha asked, sensing the seriousness in Octavia's tone. Octavia inhaled. "I've just been held up at TSA, harassed by an officer, racial profiling if you ask me." "What? Are you okay? Where are you now?" "I'm fine physically, but I need your help. I want to escalate this. The officer doubted the legitimacy of my ticket, made a spectacle, rummaged through my private documents. The airline had to intervene to get me through security." Tasha sighed on the other end. "I'm not surprised, but I'm still disgusted. It's 2025 and here we are. Let's do this. Tell me what you want. A lawsuit? A formal complaint? We can do both if you'd like. Let's start with a complaint. I'll put you in touch with Delta's legal counsel so we can have a unified approach. I don't want to destroy this officer's life, but I do want accountability. I'm also thinking bigger. Policies, training, things that can create actual systemic improvements." "That's exactly what I love about you, cuz. Always thinking of the bigger picture. Send me the details and I'll be on it." After a few more exchanges, Octavia hung up, feeling a slight sense of relief. She then messaged a handful of people in Delta's executive circle to loop them into her plan. Within minutes, she received confirmations. They wanted a formal meeting about this, which could turn into a press statement if necessary. Octavia stepped out of the private room, rejoining Martin to finalize details for her flight. Little did she know, Bradley Foster was not done with his day. The short confrontation in the screening room was only the beginning of the karmic blowback heading his way. Meanwhile, back at the security checkpoint, Bradley continued his work as if nothing significant had happened. Outwardly, he projected the same stern authority, scanning tickets and barking instructions at travelers. But inside, a swirl of conflicting emotions brewed. He felt a tinge of fear that maybe he'd gone too far this time, that maybe the woman's claims held water. His stubborn ego tried to tamp down that fear by rationalizing his behavior, telling himself he was just doing his job. Jasmine Perez had quietly shared the airline supervisor's words with Michael Thompson in a brief aside. He said she's actually very important to Delta, she told him. She might be some sort of big investor. Michael raised an eyebrow. Wow, if that's true, Brad really stepped in it. Jasmine sighed. I just hope we're not dragged down with him. We didn't stop him after all. We just let him be. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did try, but Bradley's been pushing these boundaries for a while. Maybe it's time he faces repercussions. If it comes down to it, I'll speak the truth. Jasmine nodded, though a sense of apprehension lingered. Word traveled fast in airports, and if this incident was as serious as it seemed, it wouldn't be long before heads higher up in the TSA chain became aware. Sure enough, about an hour later, Bradley's supervisor, Paula Henderson, arrived at the checkpoint. A formidable woman in her 50s, with a decades-long career in airport security, Paula knew how to maintain order and command respect. Her usual daily rounds took her to each checkpoint. However, the call she'd received from Delta's station manager accelerated her schedule. Officer Foster, she said evenly, approaching Bradley. He turned, snapping to attention. The look on Paula's face made it clear she wasn't there for a friendly chat. Let's talk in my office. Bradley followed her through a series of corridors behind the security area, each hallway lit with fluorescent fixtures and lined with doors labeled for various administrative functions. Paula's office was small but tidy, with only a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. She sat down, gesturing for Bradley to do the same. I just spoke with Delta's station manager, Paula began, her voice calm but with an edge. They informed me of an incident that took place this morning involving a passenger named Octavia Reynolds. Bradley swallowed. Yes, ma'am. I was just doing my job. There was a glitch. Paula held up a hand, cutting him off. I'm aware of the glitch. A portion of the flight manifest didn't sync correctly. That's not the core issue here. She folded her hands on the desk. Delta is extremely concerned about how you handled the passenger. They claim you behaved unprofessionally and unfairly targeted her, refusing to listen even when your colleague attempted to correct the error. Bradley opened his mouth to defend himself, but Paula pressed on. I also received a phone call from one of Miss Reynolds' legal representatives. They're threatening a formal complaint, possibly more. Now I want to hear your version, but understand that in my position I have to consider the bigger picture. He sat there, the weight of the situation hitting him. Miss Henderson, I believe there was a possibility of a fraudulent boarding pass. She had documents in her bag that looked suspicious, claiming to be some investor. I was thorough. That's all. You were thorough, Paula repeated. She leaned forward. According to Miss Perez, you singled this passenger out well before you even scanned her pass. Is that accurate? Bradley hesitated, his eyes flicking away. I noticed she didn't have a physical boarding pass in hand. That's unusual. Paula's lips formed a thin line. Officer Foster, it's 2025. Many travelers use electronic passes now. It's hardly unusual. And this passenger was in TSA pre-check. They've been vetted. Did you take that into account? Bradley swallowed. I was suspicious, ma'am. Paula's gaze hardened. Suspicion without evidence can't be your guiding principle. We've had multiple complaints in the past that suggest you're biased in your random checks. Now we have a high-profile passenger complaining of racial profiling. I don't have to tell you how serious this could become." He fidgeted, trying to maintain eye contact. "Ma'am, with all due respect, sometimes the people who pose the biggest risks don't look like it. I was doing my duty." Paula leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable for a moment. "I'm placing you on administrative review, effective immediately. We'll investigate the matter thoroughly. In the meantime, you're being reassigned to non-passenger screening duties." "What?" Bradley's voice rose in disbelief. "You're benching me? Over a misunderstanding?" Paula's jaw tightened. "Over repeated reports of targeting certain travelers. Over official complaints from an individual who is in fact a major stakeholder in Delta Airlines. And yes, a possible misunderstanding. But the bottom line is, you've drawn negative attention to this checkpoint. We can't ignore that." Bradley's mind reeled. He thought about the mortgage on his new house, the child support payments, the routine he'd built. "Miss Henderson, please," he started, but Paula stood, ending the conversation. "I suggest you cooperate with the investigation," she said. "Dismissed." Leaving Paula's office, Bradley felt a mix of anger and fear. He stalked through the corridors, heading to the break room to gather his thoughts. The uniform he wore suddenly felt heavier. For the first time, he started to realize that maybe, just maybe, he'd messed with the wrong passenger. Octavia boarded her flight to Los Angeles without further incident. She took her first-class seat, noticing the cabin's modern design and the soothing hum of the plane's engines. Flight attendants, briefed by Martin, treated her with extra care. One even brought her a complimentary glass of champagne before takeoff, though she politely declined. She didn't need champagne. She needed time to think. As the plane taxied away from the gate, her phone buzzed one last time with a message from Tasha. "Got your details. We'll coordinate with Delta's counsel. Safe flight. This is bigger than we realized. Lots of folks in TSA might be complicit." Octavia turned off her phone, settled into her seat, and gazed out the window. She understood how these issues ran deep. It wouldn't do to single out just Bradley Foster. She suspected his behavior was symptomatic of a broader cultural problem at many airports. If the TSA truly wanted to protect people, it needed to root out biases that did more harm than good. The flight itself was smooth, giving Octavia a chance to reflect. She thought about her philanthropic endeavors, especially those aimed at underrepresented communities in aviation. She remembered how she'd once funded scholarships for black pilots and flight attendants. Maybe the next phase would be focusing on training programs for airport security, ensuring accountability. If she could leverage her position as a significant stakeholder in Delta and her connections elsewhere, real change might be possible. A few hours later, the plane landed at LAX, and Octavia made her way to a waiting black SUV arranged by the airline. She had a meeting that afternoon with potential investors in a new philanthropic project. Normally, she would be laser-focused on her pitch. But today, her mind remained partially in Atlanta, replaying the encounter with Bradley. She vowed to use the energy from that anger to fuel something constructive. Meanwhile, back at Hartsfield-Jackson, events were moving swiftly. Over lunch, Jasmine Perez sat with Michael Thompson in the cafeteria, the low murmur of dozens of TSA employees around them. "Did you hear Bradley got reassigned?" she asked quietly, stirring her coffee. Michael nodded. "Yeah, I heard Paula had a stern talk with him. He's fuming." He frowned, leaning in. "Look, I know it's not easy for us to speak out, but this was overdue. You've seen how he treats people." Jasmine glanced around, ensuring no one was eavesdropping. "It's not just him. Some of the higher-ups turn a blind eye to these behaviors. We have data logs that can show how often certain officers randomly select people of color, but nobody wants to open that can of worms." Michael drummed his fingers on the table. "Well, maybe now they have to. If Miss Reynolds is as influential as they say, it could bring real scrutiny, and maybe that's a good thing." Jasmine gave a half-smile. "I think so too, but I worry about blowback. If I'm called to testify or give a statement, I won't lie. But Bradley's got friends in the agency. It might get messy. Michael nodded, understanding her unease. We'll have each other's backs. Elsewhere in the airport, Paula Henderson found herself on a call with Delta's station manager and a TSA regional director, discussing the incident. She was treading a fine line. On one hand, she needed to protect her agency and the reputation of the airport. On the other, she knew ignoring the issue would spark a legal and public relations nightmare. In the end, it was decided that a thorough internal investigation would commence. Statements would be taken from all involved, and they would attempt to defuse the situation before it escalated to national media outlets. But the wheels were already turning, both figuratively and literally. Octavia was in LA, strategizing with Tasha and the Delta legal team. Bradley was stewing in bitterness, determined to defend his actions. Paula and other TSA officials scrambled to contain the fallout, and the entire staff at Hartsfield-Jackson felt the ripple effect, knowing that something big was about to unfold. 3 days later, Octavia sat in a sleek conference room in downtown LA. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and a polished wooden table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. On one end sat Tasha, tapping away at her tablet, and at the other end were 2 attorneys from Delta, along with a regional director from the TSA who had traveled specifically for this meeting. Miss Reynolds, the TSA regional director, Randall Bowman, began. We're deeply sorry for the ordeal you experienced. This doesn't reflect the values we strive to uphold at TSA. We are investigating Officer Foster's conduct, and I assure you there will be accountability if we find wrongdoing. Octavia listened calmly. I appreciate that, Mr. Bowman. However, I want to emphasize this goes beyond one officer. I've received numerous messages from people sharing similar stories. Targeted screening, humiliation, intimidation. It suggests a systemic issue. Bowman nodded. We're aware that the TSA has had a history of racial profiling allegations. We've introduced new training modules, but clearly incidents are still happening. We'll commit to a deeper review. Tasha spoke up. We'd like to see the data on how often certain officers perform random checks, as well as any complaints filed at Hartsfield-Jackson in the past few years. This is part of building a case for or against systemic bias. The Delta lawyers chimed in, supporting the request. They wanted to mitigate any negative press for the airline, but they also recognized that championing a more equitable travel experience was good for business and morally right. Bowman shifted in his seat. We'll see what we can do, but please understand we have protocols about releasing internal data. It might require a formal FOIA request or certain legal steps. Octavia leaned forward. I'm willing to go through the formalities, but I believe the public deserves transparency. If changes aren't made voluntarily, I will have no choice but to consider other options, potentially speaking with media outlets or pursuing a broader legal strategy. A tense silence followed. Eventually, Bowman cleared his throat. Understood. For now, let's proceed in good faith. Let's attempt to address your concerns without a media firestorm. With that, the meeting moved into drafting preliminary agreements. The TSA would share certain anonymized data sets and open an inquiry into the practices at Hartsfield-Jackson, with a focus on how officers are trained and monitored for bias. In return, Octavia and her legal team would hold off on public announcements or lawsuits, giving the TSA and airport management a chance to correct the problems internally, provided they did so earnestly. As the meeting ended, Tasha exchanged business cards with everyone present. Octavia shook Bowman's hand with polite formality, noting the worry lines etched into his face. She could guess he was thinking about the broader implications. If an influential figure like Octavia Reynolds went public with stories of blatant racism, the fallout would be enormous. While these high-level negotiations took place, Bradley Foster's life was going from bad to worse. His administrative review had begun, and he was stuck in a back-office role, scanning incoming shipments and occasionally screening airport employees entering restricted areas. The tasks were monotonous, and he despised the isolation. One afternoon, as he sat in a dimly lit corner reviewing a manifest of supplies, a colleague approached. "Hey, man," said Officer Jordan Kim, who had been around for nearly as long as Bradley but maintained a spotless record. "Just heard they're scheduling interviews with staff about that incident with the Delta investor." Bradley grunted. "Yeah, they told me I'd get a hearing soon enough. I'm ready. I've done nothing wrong." Jordan hesitated. "Well, you might want to know. Jasmine Perez is telling folks she's going to speak out about your pattern of targeting certain passengers. And I heard Michael Thompson will corroborate. They're both standing up for the passenger." Bradley's chest tightened. "Are you serious? They're turning on me now? Unbelievable." He slammed a folder shut. "That's nonsense. They can't prove anything." Jordan gave a sympathetic shrug. "Look, just be prepared. They have logs of how many random checks you've done. The numbers might not look good, especially if it shows you disproportionately targeted people of color. Plus, that airline supervisor is on her side. It's going to be an uphill battle." Bradley scowled, feeling the walls closing in. After Jordan left, Bradley paced the small office thinking. Maybe he could spin it, claim that the logs didn't show context. But a gnawing voice at the back of his mind whispered that he'd gone too far this time, that he'd harbored these biases for years, and they'd finally caught up with him. He decided to call in a favor from a friend in the union, seeking advice. Yet the advice he received wasn't reassuring. "This might be bigger than the union can shield you from, Brad," his friend had said, sounding cautious. "If TSA HQ wants to make an example of someone, they might pick you. I suggest you lawyer up." The mere suggestion of needing an attorney made Bradley's stomach churn. He was proud, convinced that he was always in the right. Yet as each day passed, the sense of dread grew heavier. This unstoppable chain of events had been set in motion the moment he decided to harass a passenger he wrongly assumed was powerless. A few weeks later, Octavia sat at a polished wooden desk in her home office in Atlanta, reviewing the latest updates. Tasha had compiled a thick folder of internal TSA data regarding random checks, complaint logs, and demographic breakdowns of detainees. It painted a troubling picture. Across multiple airports, certain officers disproportionately targeted black travelers, along with other people of color. Bradley Foster's data in particular stood out like a sore thumb. 78% of his random checks involved minorities, despite them making up a smaller fraction of the passenger pool during his shifts. In addition, testimonies from Jasmine Perez and Michael Thompson were on record. Both described witnessing Bradley's behavior over time, his sneers, his sarcastic comments, his repeated refusal to let some travelers pass after initial verifications. It was damning evidence. That same day, Octavia received an email from Randall Bowman, the TSA regional director who had attended the meeting in LA. The subject line read, "Resolution and Next Steps." She opened it, finding a detailed explanation of how the TSA planned to handle Bradley Foster's case. Bradley Foster would be terminated from his position due to documented patterns of misconduct and racial profiling. The TSA would launch a new training initiative aimed at addressing implicit bias, with new oversight measures to ensure the fairness of random checks. Hartsfield-Jackson security operations would undergo an external audit, and similar audits would be considered for other major airports with concerning data. A sense of relief washed over Octavia. This was the accountability she had fought for. While it wouldn't solve systemic racism overnight, it was a tangible step forward. Later that afternoon, she received a call from Tasha. "They've officially fired him, cuz," Tasha reported. "He might still try to sue for wrongful termination, but the evidence is stacked against him. And apparently other employees are backing up the claims that he had a history of prejudice." Octavia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Let's hope this sets an example. In the following days, local news outlets picked up on the story. Though Octavia had been reluctant to speak publicly, a leak had occurred, and her involvement as a major investor in Delta came to light, along with the details of Bradley's termination. Headlines read, TSA officer fired for racial profiling high-profile Delta investor. And bias in the skies. TSA faces scrutiny after incident at Atlanta airport. Some national outlets even ran short segments on it. Octavia, while unaccustomed to the spotlight, decided to participate in one carefully arranged interview, emphasizing the bigger picture rather than her personal ordeal. On a bright Monday morning, she sat across from a local news anchor on a live broadcast. "Miss Reynolds, you've leveraged your position to push for changes within TSA. What do you hope travelers across the country will take away from this incident?" the anchor asked. Octavia smiled softly. "That accountability matters. No matter your position or background, if you perpetuate discrimination, there can and should be consequences. This isn't just about punishing one individual. It's about ensuring fair treatment for all travelers. We've made progress, but there's still a long road ahead." She received a wave of supportive messages after the segment. Colleagues and friends praised her for turning a personal affront into a broader push for reform. Yet Octavia remained grounded. She knew racism didn't vanish just because one officer was fired. Still, the incident served as a catalyst for renewed conversations about bias in airport security and travel. In a twist of irony, Delta also announced a new philanthropic partnership that very same week, one of Octavia's brainchild projects, which aimed to offer scholarship funds for young people of color pursuing careers in aviation and security. The press release garnered positive attention, overshadowing Bradley's angry attempts to paint himself as a scapegoat. From behind the scenes, Octavia and Tasha kept an eye on Bradley. They heard rumors he was trying to mount a defense, claiming reverse discrimination and an unjust system that bowed to a wealthy sponsor. But the facts wouldn't budge. Eventually, he faded from public interest. In the end, the man who had tried to humiliate Octavia found himself jobless, facing social disgrace and on the losing end of a legal and moral battle. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy for Octavia Reynolds, at least externally. She traveled often, continuing to oversee her investments and philanthropic ventures. Yet something had shifted within her, a growing resolve that had always been there, but now it shone brighter, fueled by the public nature of her recent experience. She became slightly more open about her role in Delta, recognizing that sometimes visibility is key to sparking systemic change. Though she still guarded her privacy, she allowed the world to see just enough to remind them that a black woman held immense influence in areas people often overlook. Meanwhile, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport implemented new, more transparent protocols for random screenings. Officers received additional training on recognizing and combating unconscious bias. Paula Henderson oversaw these changes personally, determined not to let the scandal fade without meaningful progress. Jasmine Perez and Michael Thompson received commendations for their honesty and courage in cooperating with the investigation. Their day-to-day duties continued, but now with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity about what they stood for. They no longer had to quietly roll their eyes at Bradley's antics. They were part of a shift in the TSA culture. It was a small victory, but one that mattered greatly. As for Bradley Foster, he spent several months drifting from one short-term job to another. The stigma of being fired from TSA for discriminatory behavior followed him like a dark cloud. Potential employers balked at hiring someone with that kind of record. In a moment of introspection, he wondered how he had allowed his biases to ruin his career. But that moment of clarity, if it truly came, was overshadowed by resentment that he directed at Octavia, the TSA, and a world he felt had turned against him. His anger might have made him a cautionary tale, the man who lost everything because he couldn't see past his prejudice. In the end, the story serves as a reminder that the lines we draw, between ordinary travelers and powerful insiders, between prejudice and justice, are not as rigid as some might think. You never truly know who you're dealing with and what they stand for. In a single morning, a seemingly routine act of racial profiling ignited a chain reaction that forced an entire system to reevaluate itself. Octavia emerged not only vindicated, but more resolute, and Bradley, in a karmic turn, found himself facing the consequences of his own narrow-minded actions. It was, as they say, the perfect storm of drama, revelation, and hard-won redemption. Thank you for joining us on this emotional roller coaster of injustice, perseverance, and ultimate triumph. Octavia's journey reminds us that real power isn't always loud or visible. It can be the quiet force for positive change behind the scenes. Her determination not only brought accountability to one misguided TSA agent, but also sparked a renewed dialogue about systemic bias in airport security. She showed us that sometimes you need to stand firm, even when it's easier to let an offense slide, because larger reforms often hinge on one pivotal moment of courage. If this story moved you, if it made you question, reflect, or cheer, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing real-life narratives and bold dramatizations that illuminate important issues. Together, let's keep the conversation going and fuel the change we want to see.